Okay. I mean, there are numerous examples of civic activism in South Korea, but the ones that I focused in my book was a particular kind, very organized, institutionalized civic activism. So if I can start from that example, there are an organization called in South Korea called the Citizens Organization or 시민단체. And of course, nowadays, when we say 시민단체, people think about all kinds of organizations. But I was focusing on sort of, in a way, first generation of civic citizens organization. These organizations define themselves as organization for social change, institutional change toward more democratic society. There can be all kinds of political activism, but not all political activism can be considered civic activism, right? Both in South Korea and here in US, we see ultra right-wing group very much mobilizing themselves and very actively involved in political activism, but they are not really working toward, further democratization. Civic activism, I would define more specifically in connection to democracy or democratization. Whole idea of civic is it connotes one's membership in, a political community where people are participating, right? So this notion of a civic republicanism, for example. So I would make some meaningful distinction here between civic activism and political activism, in general, right?
Um, I think civic activism is a very broad term, and I think it's really great that Seung-suk and I are speaking together at this forum because Seung-suk's research and book focuses more on the, I would say, everyday advocacy and organizing campaigns by civic organizations, whereas my work is more on the popular protest, contentious politics that are taking place at the national level. So in addition to those everyday campaigns and advocacy activities by civil organizations, South Korea also has seen a number of waves of popular protest before and after the democratic transition in the late 80s. And I could just, come up with lots of examples of those popular protests, beginning with the protest for labor rights in 1997, and then to ask political parties not to nominate corrupt candidates in 2000, and then to amend the obsolete relations with American military presence in 2002, and against U.S. Beef import in 2008, and then about the truth finding of the Sewol disaster in 2014, and against the femicide that happened at Gangnam Station in 2016, and of course the impeachment of the corrupt and incompetent president in 2016 and 17, and the ongoing protest to restore democracy in South Korea. So we have a lot of examples, not only on the ground, everyday level, but also at this national and quite contentious mass protest aspect of civic activism in South Korea.
Again, I want to emphasize that it's not exclusively Korean or something, uniquely Korean. I wouldn't say so. But I think Korean case illuminates certain things that we might be able to observe in a more heightened way or accentuated way. So it's easy to, in a way, discern certain things. And one of them is, I would say, the importance of global politics or geopolitics to the practices of democracy or democratization movement. When we pay attention to Korean experiences of civic activism, the importance of global politics and geopolitics becomes really illuminated. Korean case also shows how, the democracy is something that America has been promoting since, the end of World War II, right? Since Cold War. And US have promoted a very particular kind of liberal democracy. And Korea, especially as a clientele state of, US as a military empire, have been very much influenced by, this kind of rhetoric and practices. And I show in my book that how citizens organizations um, are trying to push the boundary of this American democracy. This is more about the dynamic among people who are involved in civic activism in Korean context, that even among people who are trying to bring about democratic social change, there is always a hierarchy and inequality in terms of, the skills and expertise in terms of how to articulate their issues, how to organize, right? How to, work with the different political, social institutions. So there is always this, enduring and lingering inequality between, for example, professional activists and, lay members.
I think something that really defines Korean politics or history is the presence of very strong civil society, very broadly defined, or the recurrence of mass social movements that have charted the political development in the country. So some scholars would even say that Korean citizens are participatory democrats, meaning that they feel greater political efficacy when they are participating in these direct forms of politics, rather than, say, more in the institutional forms of political participation. And although not all of those collective efforts resulted in political change, but still Koreans, by working together in the streets, they were able to achieve major political breakthroughs and transformations. So I think that really reinforces this political efficacy for being participatory Democrats. And I think another distinctive aspect of Korean civil society is there is a variety of civic organizations, as Seung-suk discusses in detail in her book, but also there are these big organizations that are interested in all kinds of political, social, cultural agendas to make Korean democracy more inclusive, more diverse, and deeper. And through this process of building civic organizations and by mobilizing citizens in the streets, these organizations were able to create, as I argue in my book, national solidarity infrastructure, which I think very strong in South Korea, whereas it may not be present in other places necessarily. So for instance, particularly if you compare with civil society in Japan, civil society in Japan is very strong at the local level, at the community level, but when it comes to national agenda or national politics or political reform, very weak. So I think that really provides some kind of a comparative aspect to understanding the strength of the national level of civil society in South Korea?
Many societies, especially after, the end of Cold War, so-called democratization, neoliberal globalization, and this US-style democratization, and people thought that democracy will bring about prosperity, some modicum of security and a good life. But they are not really seeing that. They are not really living that reality. So in a way, disappointment with, oh, maybe democracy is not really delivering what it was promising to do, right? So this combination of, the demagogues really capitalizing on people's frustration, anger, and fear, and this, disillusionment of democracy really work together to erode public confidence and desire for democracy. So in a way, uh, it's a complex problem, but one big thing that we need to tackle here is really uh, reducing economic inequality and create promoting economic democracy, locally, regionally, nationally, and that's the hardest, in a way, challenge for a lot of, the democracy or civic activism.
Again, I want to revisit the notion of strong civil society that promotes the civil spirit. And I think one of the reasons why President Yoon's martial law failed in a couple of hours was because he underestimated the strength of democratic citizenship in South Korea. And not only among these young people who ran to the streets to protest, but also those young citizens in the military, political police forces, and even the presidential security agency, who were really for whom martial law and using the military was just unimaginable, in their life. And some protesters were holding this banner when I was in Seoul back in December. Martial law jumped out of the textbook. So this kind of authoritarian politics for these young citizens is really the relic of the past. It's unimaginable that that can happen in 2024 or 2025. So in that sense, I'm optimistic that democracy will survive and will be strengthened in the coming years. But at the same time, I'm also pessimistic for two reasons. One is the growing political polarization across different parties and forces. And on this extreme right side, they've been very well organized and mobilized since the early 2000s in the name of the new right. And it's not just, hundreds of, senior citizens, but there are intellectuals, there are demagogues, there are these YouTubers, there are evangelical religious leaders in churches, and even the so-called conservative party members are now aligning with these, far-right groups who, as Seung-Sung mentioned, who use this, a Cold War authoritarian language and discourse to attack democratic citizens as well as political opposition. So
One thing, quick comments about the younger generation, but then also there is a polarization among, younger generation like older generation. A lot of young men in their 20s and 30s are really spending a lot of time in social media, YouTube, and they are also one very important social group that supports this kind of authoritarian movement, right? So I think the growing power of social media, internet in um, democratic or formerly democratic society is going to be really, or it has become already a big factor in
Mm.
how the political dynamic will move.